What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today we're going to be ranking all of the Warzone primary weapons after the Season 4 Reloaded update, where we saw quite a large weapon rebalance. I feel like it's time now that things have settled down a little bit for me to rank the weapons. I haven't done one of these in a long time, and I searched forever trying to find a good one of these tier makers, and I couldn't find one, so I created my own, and I spent a little bit too much time doing it, but this is all updated with every gun that's in the game currently, or every primary gun. It's all labeled properly and properly formatted, and even color-coded for the weapon type. So if you guys are interested in making your own tier maker for this, I will leave a link to this one in the description below, just because I think it is the best one out there. And please feel free to tweet me your tiers as well. I'm interested in seeing what other people select for their different weapon rankings. And without further ado, let's hop right into it and start it off with the AS Val. Now the AS Val, for solos and duos, I would 100% put this in top tier meta. This is incredible for solos and duos because it has a ridiculous time to kill potential. However, it doesn't really have the versatility to hold its own properly in trios and quads, or at least not as a meta weapon. So therefore, I am going to drop it down to very solid, but just keep that in mind. For solos and duos, it is meta. Then getting into the Odin. The Odin is one of those guns where it has a lot of great potential. It's very accurate. Its time to kill potential is solid, but it requires a lot of accuracy, and it's very unforgiving if you miss any shots. And as a result, I am going to drop it down to viable. I wanted to put it in very solid, but it's just not quite versatile enough for that. After that, we got the M4A1, and this one I think pretty comfortably falls into the very solid category right now. If you look at this in the time to kill charts, which I will leave a link to my time to kill sheets and stuff in the description below as well, it is near the bottom of the list now for assault rifles, but this is a very accurate assault rifle, and mixing just one headshot in up close, which is easy to do, will give you a very competitive time to kill. So that's why I still want to keep it in the very solid section. It's a super versatile gun, super accurate, and you can get great time to kill potentials as long as you're landing a headshot or two. Then when it comes to the Ram 7, even though this one got a nerf, I'm still going to put it in the very solid department as well. I think it's still a great all-around gun. You can be very successful with this at most ranges, but it's not top tier meta anymore in my opinion, so it just falls comfortably into very solid. After that, we've got the M13, and just like with the M4A1, it doesn't really have a great time to kill potential. It's near the bottom of the list for assault rifles, but again, this is a very accurate gun, even more so than the M4, and mixing a single headshot in at any range will reduce our time to kill potential, and therefore, I love the M13. I always have liked this in Warzone, and I think it is great in the game's current state, but not meta, so therefore, also very solid. You'll notice a trend here with assault rifles. Many of them will be very solid, and I think this is good news, actually. But moving on to the Kilo 141, I'm actually going to put this in the viable category. I was thinking not great, but it is a very viable gun still. It's just at really long ranges, it has that terrible damage potential and time to kill. And therefore, there's no way I could possibly put this in the very solid category. So that's going to be viable. FR556, I think we all know that's terrible. If you use it in semi-auto, I would maybe bring it up to viable, but as a space gun, no, it's terrible. I think most of us know that. AK-47, the Modern Warfare Edition. After this update, I'm going not great with this. I don't think it has enough power and redeeming qualities for its lack of recoil control, and therefore that's where I'm going to put that. Some people might argue that it's more on the viable side. I just don't like it though, so I'm throwing it in not great. Then with the FAL, very solid, especially if you have a good trigger finger. The FAL is still a great choice. CR56 AMAX, I don't think they destroyed this gun with the updates. They definitely have been nerfing it, and it's absolutely not a meta weapon anymore, but I still think it's a very solid setup. You can still use that and find a ton of success. Then getting into the Black Ops Cold War AK-47, I think this is top tier meta depending on how you're using it and how you're setting it up. For closer to mid-ranges, this thing is great. Competes with SMGs just fine, and then you can stretch it a bit longer than most SMGs can with its range potential as well as its bullet velocity and everything that goes along with that, with it being an assault rifle. So yeah, I am going to throw that as a top-tier meta. Then we have the Grau 556. I'm going to throw this in the viable section. I just don't think it's very solid anymore. I think it's absolutely usable, still a very accurate gun. You can play well with it, but it's not amazing by any means anymore. After that, we have the AN-94, and this is another gun I think I'm going to throw in the viable section. I personally don't really like it. I think the hyperburst kind of throws me off a bit. The recoil isn't great with this gun, in my opinion, and therefore, it's still very usable, and the time to kill potential is solid on this. I just don't really like it a whole lot, though. As for the FFAR, this is very solid, almost even meta. And the crazy thing about this, like, it didn't get changed at all. It didn't get buffed or anything with the Season 4 Reloaded update. But since most of the other assault rifles got nerfed, and the FFAR still has a great time to kill potential, and it sort of just stayed the same, it has now become one of the better assault rifles to use. So if you guys haven't used it in a while just because it got so many nerfs a while back, I'd recommend checking it out again. I think you'll be very impressed with the FFAR. Then we got the QBZ-83. This is one of my favorite guns with this update. Absolutely top tier meta. You just got to make sure you're landing those upper torso or headshots, which is really easy to do with how accurate this gun is. So absolutely top tier meta. Same thing goes with the Krig 6. People are really starting to catch on to the Krig 6 now as well. This is absolutely a meta gun. It is so accurate, and that's the main thing that keeps it in the top tier meta. Then when it comes to the XM4, this one, I think it's still very solid, maybe down to viable. The base time to kill potential without any headshots is pretty bad now, but it is fairly forgiving. It's got a decent fire rate, and landing headshots absolutely helps you out with your time to kill. So I'm going to throw it in the very solid category. Same thing goes with the Groza. Groza, after this update, very solid. Similar to the FFAR, I don't think this got any nerfs or buffs or anything with the update, but since everything else got nerfed, it now kind of rose to the top of assault rifles. FARA-83, hands down, top tier meta, probably the best gun in the game right now. This thing is just so versatile at close range, long ranges. It holds its own just fine everywhere. Then we get into the C58, which absolutely used to be top tier meta and still may be. I'm kind of torn though, and for me personally, based on my personal feel and preferences, I'm going to drop it down to very solid. If I could, I would put it right in the middle here. It's just on the edge of being top tier and very solid. But I'm going to throw it in the very solid department. I know some people will disagree with that, and that's totally fine. If you guys disagree, there's nothing wrong with that. I hope you guys don't get offended that I picked a different gun to go into very solid instead of top tier meta, but that's where I'm going to place the C58. But then when it comes to the Scar 17, if again, just like with the AS Val, if we're talking solos or duos, I'm going to put this in the very solid department. However, since it doesn't have the greatest magazine capacity, this really holds it back for trios and quads. And that unfortunately drops it down to just being viable. If this had a larger magazine capacity, 100% I'd be throwing it in the very solid department. So that's it for assault rifles. Now let's move on to the SMGs, and we'll kick it off with the Cold War MP5. I'm going to throw that in the very solid department. I don't think it's the top tier meta SMG anymore, but it is still a very good gun to be using, so absolutely still up there. Striker 45, it has very few redeeming qualities. I'm throwing it in terrible. I think the time to kill is just awful. Even with headshots, it's awful. It is accurate. That's the one thing it's got going for it, but it doesn't have a very forgiving fire rates. Terrible time to kill potential. It's terrible. As for the Modern Warfare MP5, though, 100% top tier meta, probably the best SMG in the game currently as far as versatility in the SMG department, so absolutely top tier. Fennec, I want to say, is in the viable department. This has an amazing time to kill, and in solos and duos, I would probably bump this up a notch, but since it has a really fast fire rate combined with a limited magazine capacity potential, that doesn't make it great for trios and quads. So I'm just going to throw that in viable, and it's a similar story with the ISO, basically the same story there. I'm going to throw that in the viable department, but I would probably bump it up a notch for solos. Then when it comes to the PP19, it's not great. I don't think it's completely terrible and completely unusable, but it's not great by any means. Then the 41 AE rounds on the Uzi. This is very solid, always has been. I love the 41 AE rounds on the Uzi, but we only get a 32 round magazine capacity, so that prevents it from being top tier meta. The standard Uzi, I'm going to put it right there with the PP19. It's not great. Then the P90, I don't know. This one is a little bit tricky. I am tempted to put it in the very solid department, especially because of the bullet velocity you can get. But then when you factor in the long range time to kill, as well as the side-to-side bounce you get with the recoil, it lacks that versatility, and it's not the most amazing SMG up close, and therefore I'm going to throw it in the viable section instead. As for the MP7, this is one of my personal favorites right now. I'm throwing it in top tier meta. It doesn't kill the fastest up close in the SMG department, but it has a very competitive time to kill. The main thing with this is it's competitive at any range, just about any range. Even against assault rifles at 50 meters, the MP7 is very solid, and therefore it deserves a spot in the top tier meta in my opinion. As for the Modern Warfare AUG with the 9mm round, so the standard version of this, I'm going to throw that in the very solid department right now. It's got a great time to kill potential, especially with a headshot mixed in. It's It's quite a forgiving gun, and it's just easy to use, but it lacks that large magazine capacity, which prevents it from being a top-tier meta weapon. Then getting into the AUG 5.56, again, I'm going to throw this in the very solid department. When you have the 5.56 rounds, you're likely using the drum mag, which is really going to slow down your movement speed, and that's mainly what prevents it from being top-tier meta. That, as well as the recoil. It does have a good amount of side-to-side bounce with it. So, very solid, not top-tier. Time to kill potential is incredible, though. Then we get into the nail gun. This used to have like a great niche purpose that made it very solid, but after these updates, it got nerfed, and I'm going to put it in the not great department. Just doesn't have any versatility. The nail velocity is terrible. It is accurate. The time to kill potential is now sort of middle of the road for SMGs. It's not incredible by any means, and therefore I'm just going to throw it in the not great department. Next up, we have the PPSH, and I'm going to say that pretty comfortably sits in the very solid department. It's not quite meta. Its time to kill prevents it from being super meta, but it is a very good SMG. I'm super happy picking one of these up off the ground at the beginning of a game, so absolutely very solid gun. Then we have the Bullfrog. I think this has been demoted all the way down to the viable stages at this point. It's a decent gun. You can use it. You can find success, but it's no longer up there in the very solid or top tier department, in my opinion. But after that, we've got the MAC-10, which is top-tier meta for sure. Then the OTS-9, up close, this is top-tier meta. However, it doesn't really hold its own beyond like 10 meters or so, and therefore, I'm going to say very solid, and that's assuming you're treating it right and really only using this in very close quarter situations. Next up, we have the KSP-45. I'm going to say that probably fits in the not great department. I'm not saying you can't use this and find success. It's just not going to be as consistent and versatile as many of the full auto SMGs. So yeah, that just leaves it in the not great department. Same thing goes with the LC-10. Actually, I'm going to throw SL-10 in more of the viable area. You can use it. It's kind of like the Bullfrog. You can use it. You can do well, but it's just outclassed in many other ways by many of these other SMGs. And it's a similar story with the AK-74U. I want to like this gun. It has a great time to kill potential if you're only hitting upper torso and headshots, and it is fairly versatile, but it doesn't have a great base time to kill potential, so it's not forgiving if you're hitting stomach or leg shots or arm shots, for instance. So I'm just going to throw it in the viable department as well. And then finally for SMGs, Milano, no surprises here. It is still a top-tier meta SMG for sure. Now, let's move on to the LMGs, and with the LMGs, I'm just going to say up front, I don't think any of them are going to fall in the meta category, simply because they are held back by their mobility and their handling, and this is why you don't tend to see top-tier players using LMGs. They just lack that versatility that assault rifles have, and you have most of the same upsides with assault rifles without the big downsides. Having said that, I do think a lot of these can be very solid or viable. Let's kick it off with the M91. I think it's going to fall in the viable department. It's great as an LMG. You can treat it really well and find success, but it's not in the very solid department. The Bruin, I do think, is very solid still. I don't think they nerfed this thing so hard that it is no longer great. I think it's still a great LMG, just not top tier. Then with the MG82, I still think this is very solid as well. I know this was like completely overpowered when they first added it, and then they nerfed it back, and now basically nobody uses it, but I still consider it to be a very solid LMG. You can find a lot of success with that. Then we're going to move on to the M60, which I just realized I have incorrectly labeled as the M91. I'm going to have to fix that. I'll get that fixed before I upload this for you guys. But I'm going to put this in the not great department. I don't think it's very good at all. Has very few redeeming factors. Its time to kill potential is just the worst out of all of these LMGs. As for the Stoner 63, this is very, very solid, super accurate, great time to kill potential, so definitely very solid. Same thing goes with the RPD. If you build that right, you can have a lot of success with that. Then we get into the Fin with the adverse barrel. Assuming the adverse barrel is working, which it seems to be hit or miss as to when this is going to actually work, I think the Fin is very solid with the adverse barrel, but they did also nerf it pretty hard, so you have to hit upper torso shots now. And as a result, that is actually going to drop it down to viable. It used to be very, very solid, and yeah, I've changed my mind on that. It is now more in the viable department. You can still do well with it. Standard Fin, extremely accurate, but not super forgiving, and therefore I am going to throw it in this area right here as viable as well. Then we've got the MG34, and time to kill wise, this is very solid, but it does have absolutely terrible handling, and therefore it's going to be in the viable section. PKM, very, very solid. Holger 26, if you set it up right, I think this could be more in the viable department. I don't think it's amazing, but you can set it up so that it is quite solid. And then the SA-87, I still think this is an underrated LMG. I'm going to throw it in the very solid department. I think a lot of people haven't realized the full potential of this. It has no open bolt delay. It's one of the few LMGs that doesn't have an open bolt delay. It's got a very solid time to kill potential. It's accurate enough, and its mobility isn't as bad as some of the other LMGs. So yeah, very solid when it comes to SA-87. Now, let's get into the Marksman and Tactical Rifles, and when it comes to the EBR-14, I'm going to say it is now in the viable stage. The fact that it uses sniper ammo really holds it back, I feel. Otherwise, I'd probably bump it to very solid, but it's still a very usable gun. You're just heavily limited by that sniper ammo. Mark II Carbine, unfortunately, terrible. I would love to see something done to this to make it viable without being overpowered, but it's kind of a difficult one to balance due to its fire rate. The standard Modern Warfare crossbow, I think if you're using explosive rounds, I would call it a viable weapon as an overkill secondary or something. But it is also fairly niche at the same time. I'll still keep it in the viable department, though, just because of those explosive bolts. As for the Type 63, I think I'm going to throw that in the viable department as well. If you're landing headshots, you can absolutely perform well with this, but it's not the most forgiving or most versatile gun out there, so I'm just going to throw it in viable. DMR-14, I'm going to keep that in the very solid department. I think it is still very solid. It's got a great potential with it. It's no longer that ridiculous overpowered gun that it used to be, but you can use that at longer ranges, and if you treat it right, you can find a lot of success with that gun. As for the AUG, I'm going to go with viable on this. I'm tempted to even put it in the not great department, but I'm going to go viable. You can use it. You can find success. Same thing with the M16. I feel like they kind of fall in the same area together. Carve 2, I'm going to go so far as to say that it's not great. I don't really like the Carve 2. I would rather use an Auger and M16. Then with the R1 Shadowhunter, which is the Cold War crossbow, I think it's in the not great department. You can definitely get some nice kills with it. It does have a decent killing potential in that sense, but it's obviously not a very versatile weapon, not nearly as versatile as the explosive bolt on the Modern Warfare crossbow, so it's got to be one step down from that for sure. Then we got the SKS, which is basically the same as the EBR, so I'm going to be throwing that in the viable section. Again, uses sniper ammo if I remember correctly, which will hold it back from being as good as it can be. And then let's get into more of the sniper rifles. I know SPR and CAR are still marksman rifles, but they're effectively sniper rifles in Warzone. SPR, very solid. I love it. Very, very versatile. It's kind of the nice in-between of an aggressive sniper as well as a long-range sniper. It's that perfect in-between, I feel. So I'm going to throw it in very solid. CAR 98, top-tier meta. No question about that. Even though a lot of people have switched to the Swiss, CAR 98 is still incredible. Pellington, I'm going to say, is very solid. It's not quite as good as the CAR or the Swiss due to its flinch and a couple other factors as well, but it's still a decent gun to be using. It's solid for sniping. And ZRG 20mm, I'm going to say, like, I almost want to put it in top tier meta, but I'm going to go with very solid instead. Swiss K31, it's right up there with the CAR 98. Honestly, I could use either one of these and I'll be pretty much just as successful. I've seen a lot of people ask me which one is better now. They're basically equal, I would say. Then we have the M82. I think this is viable. It is kind of nice to have a semi-auto sniper rifle that can deal a decent amount of damage, but it's not going to have the same killing potential as these others. So we're just going to keep it in the viable department. Tundra, I still think is very solid, mainly due to the fact that you can get a ridiculously good bullet velocity with that, or at least a very solid. I guess they nerfed that a little bit. You can still get a very solid bullet velocity, still a very solid sniper rifle. AX50, I just don't think it's quite as good as, like, the Tundra, for instance. I'm going to throw it in viable. Rytec AMR, not great at all. Dragunov, terrible, unfortunately. I would love the Dragunov to be more usable, but it's just not. And the HDR, I think I'm going to throw that with the AX50 in the viable, but not really great department. And with that just leaves us with shotguns. And I'm going to be completely honest with you guys. I basically never touch shotguns anymore. So I might be a little bit out of touch with my rankings here. So just keep that in mind as I'm going through this. A lot of this is based on my memory of using these shotguns. And I realize most of them haven't changed at all lately. So yeah, forgive me if I'm a little off on the shotguns here. But when it comes to the Street Sweeper, I believe it is still a very solid choice for a shotgun. If you're going to be using a shotgun, it's one of the better choices. Howard 77... not great. It's a pump action, and you're really only going to get a one-shot kill if the enemy isn't fully armored. So, not great in my opinion. Gallo 12, I still think is very viable as well, or very solid, I would say. VLK Rogue, I feel like they nerfed that one a little bit. I'm unsure if this is very solid still, or if it's now just more viable. I'm going to put it in viable just to be safe, but maybe that does kind of fall in line with the Street Super and Gallo still. The 725, since you have those two shots available, you can get really quick, consistent two taps. And therefore, I'm going to keep it as viable because at the same time, if you're dealing with multiple enemies, you're not going to have time to reload that. Or if you miss one of your two shots, you're going to be in trouble with that. So that brings it down to viable. R90, very solid as well. I think Dragon's Breath on that is still decent. Like, you can still perform quite well with that as a shotgun. Origin 12, also still a very viable option as a shotgun, or a very solid option as a shotgun. Again, assuming you're treating it as a shotgun and keeping yourself close quarters. Model 680, I think that falls right in line with the Howler 77. The fact that it's a pump action, and I don't believe you have the ability to one-shot kill against a fully plated enemy. That just makes it very, very unforgiving and not a great choice to be using. And then the Jack 12, I don't have a ton of experience with this. I've heard with like slug options, this can be a lot better, but I'm going to instead throw it in the viable department just because it's not the most versatile out there, especially if you're using slugs on it. So yeah, I'm going to throw that in viable, and there we have it. That is my tier list and my ranking for the current state of Warzone weapons. Of course, I'd like to know in the comment section below, are there any that you disagree with on this list, or like strongly disagree with and feel like should have been somewhere else? Or do you generally feel like this list is close to what your list would be? And again, I will leave this tier maker linked in the description below, hopefully with that M60 fix in there as well, so it's labeled properly. And I really want to see from you guys on Twitter. If you wouldn't mind tweeting me your list, I would love to see your tier maker here, to see just where everybody else is sort of falling when it comes to their rankings of these weapons. But yeah, with that, that's going to wrap it up for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed this one, and I'll talk to you guys next time.